Hi everyone. Today we're going to continue talking about the solar system, but we are going to change speeds just a bit. We're not going to be talking about planets. We're going to be talking about other types of objects that are in our solar system. And to put it simply, we're going to be talking today about space rocks. Now, these are things that you've heard of before, but we're going to try to see if we can't figure out exactly what they are. If you need to get a hold of me, my email address is on the screen, rcrawford@jcpsmail.org, and that is absolutely the best way to get a message to me. All right, so the two types of space rocks that I want us to look at today are asteroids versus meteoroids. Okay, and so keep in mind, I'm simply calling these things space rocks. And if you take a look at this actual picture of an asteroid, you can see why I would choose to just call them space rocks. Notice immediately that they are not round like the planets that we've been looking at. I often like to say that asteroids and meteoroids are potato shaped. Now that's a little bit of a simplification, but what I would want you to know is they're all oddly shaped and they're all unique, much like the rocks that you go outside and find laying on Earth. So let's take a look at what an asteroid actually is. So an asteroid is any large, notice that large is underlined, odd-shaped chunk of rock and metal in our solar system. So asteroids are large and they're odd-shaped. Um, so the odd-shaped bit is meant to differentiate it from a planet. Okay, so we know that planets are generally round. We know that some of our planets are also made of rock and metal, though. So it's the shape, and that shape comes down to size. Okay, so asteroids are relatively small compared to planets. You can see that they have a size range of 30 feet to almost 580 miles. So that is an enormous range. Please note that they are just not large enough to become round like the planets are. Meteoroids, on the other hand, meteoroids are just small, odd-shaped chunks of rock and metal. So really the difference between an asteroid and a meteoroid is one of scale, it's one of size. So meteoroids are small, odd-shaped chunks of rock and metal, and really we're talking about things that are in the size range from microscopic grains of dust all the way up to about 30 feet across. So 30 feet across to microscopic. So the primary difference really between an asteroid and a meteoroid is one of size. And the primary difference between an asteroid and a planet is also of size, and that size also impacts the shape that they have. So remember, potato-shaped, odd-shaped objects, and asteroids are large, meteoroids are small. Most of our asteroids we're going to find in what we call the asteroid belt, sometimes called the main asteroid belt. And the asteroid belt is located, as you can see here in this picture, it's located between the orbits of Mars and of Jupiter. And so in between Mars and Jupiter, you're going to find this collection, this ring of asteroids. Now, if we look at this picture, we might be led to believe that those asteroids are very crowded in there. Well, that's not actually true. Those asteroids inside the asteroid belt are actually very far apart. Most of the asteroids are over 3 times the distance from Earth to the moon. And so we can also see that we have some other asteroids. These are called Trojan asteroids. You don't need to necessarily know this, but not all asteroids in our solar system are in the main asteroid belt. These Trojan asteroids shown in this picture are actually following or preceding Jupiter, and they are held in place by Jupiter's gravity. So the main asteroid belt is where we are going to find most of the asteroids in our solar system, and that belt is between the orbits of Mars and Jupiter. I guess the last thing I would point out is I've said the asteroid belt is not crowded. In fact, there's just not as many asteroids as many people believe either. If we were to somehow be able to take all those asteroids and push them together into one bigger object, we would end up with something that was smaller than Earth's moon. And so, Earth's moon, while relatively big, is still a pretty small object in our solar system. Just a quick mention for, I know some of you may have this as an object, so I don't want to go too far. There are some asteroids, some of the bigger asteroids, that have managed to become round in shape. And so the dwarf planet Ceres is part of the main asteroid belt. And please note that Ceres is large enough to take on that round shape. So Ceres, a dwarf planet, can be found also in that main asteroid belt. So, not to give you anything new to worry about, but please note that asteroids these larger objects can and have collided with Earth. Um, as scientists have looked across the surface of the Earth, they can find the remnants or the evidence of several impacts with these large, odd-shaped bits of rock and metal. Now, as you can imagine, if you have a chunk of rock hurling from space at thousands of miles per hour, that's going to leave a mark. That would not be a good thing for Earth. And the bigger the object, the worse it would be. In fact, in the past, asteroids have collided with the Earth, and they've caused what we call mass extinctions. Some of you may know that scientists believe that an asteroid striking Earth was actually why the dinosaurs disappeared so rapidly. That would be one example of a mass extinction event that happened about 65 million years ago. So we really like it when these asteroids stay inside of the asteroid belt, or they stay trapped by the gravity of planets. When an asteroid becomes rogue, meaning that it's kind of a free agent and it's just drifting around, it might accidentally collide with us, and that's bad for life on our planet. So we know that meteoroids are these bits of rock, these small chunks of rock in space. We know that asteroids are these bigger chunks of rock. But meteoroids can be a little bit confusing because scientists have three terms that sort of describe these, and this is based on location. So a meteoroid is a small, odd-shaped chunk of rock and metal when it's in space. Okay? Now, that same object, nothing else has changed other than it has entered Earth's atmosphere. We now change its name. So that small chunk of rock and metal, now we call it a meteor. Um, so once it gets inside of Earth's atmosphere, some of you have undoubtedly seen these. Sometimes we call them shooting stars. A meteor is just really when a meteoroid from space enters our atmosphere. Friction from the gases in our atmosphere cause it to get really hot, and it produces a streak of light. Most often, uh, the meteors are actually destroyed by Earth's atmosphere. And you can see here in this picture, that's that chunk of rock and metal that is being destroyed in our inside of our atmosphere. So nothing changed other than its location. A meteorite, which is very similar, as I hope you guys can see that these can be pretty easily confused terms. A meteorite is that same chunk of metal, but maybe it didn't burn up. So maybe it actually survived the trip through the atmosphere. Maybe it was the angle that it came in on. Maybe it was just large enough to not burn up completely, but it actually survives and it lands on the surface of the Earth. Once that chunk of rock and metal lands on the surface of the Earth, we now change its name again. We call it a meteorite. Most meteors are destroyed in Earth's atmosphere, so this is actually very, very rare. As a result, there are people who collect these meteorites, and they pay millions of dollars for some of them. So, to review, a meteoroid is a small chunk of rock and metal in space. Once we move that same chunk of rock and metal into Earth's atmosphere, we call it a meteor, aka some of you think of them as shooting stars. Once we move that rock and metal, if it survives and it lands on Earth's surface, we call it a meteorite. All right, guys, that's going to do it for today. That should cover the basics of space rocks for you. And I believe soon we're going to be talking about another type of object that you have heard of and some of you may have observed. And of course, I'm talking about comets. Have a great